الثالثة بأعلى أصواتكم.
أفلح من صلى على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من شر الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية سيدي ومولاي علي بن أبي طالب. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا وحبيبنا أبا القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. Respected scholars, elders, my dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the courtroom of Yazid, a speech took place that Sayyidah Zainab started that shook the very foundations of Yazid's courtroom that day. And if we were to take this speech and analyze it, we would understand in itself the message of Karbala. When we look at Karbala, many people look at the event in itself, yet few people would look at what led to the event of Karbala. And inshallah, I will take these 2 nights to talk about what led to Karbala to occur. Now, if we want to look at this from a historical perspective, we don't go back 1 or 2 years prior to Karbala. I want to look at it in a number of stages, starting firstly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Secondly, I'd like to look at the Battle of Badr and the significance it had on the effect of Karbala. Thirdly, I'd like to look at Ghadir. In Ghadir Khum, what happened that day that led to Karbala? And fourth, I'd like to look at the rule of Imam Ali alayhi salam and his 4.5 year Khilafah. Fifth, I'd like to look at Muawiyah's reign and the treaty between Muawiyah and Imam Hassan alayhi salam. And I would like to conclude to look at the sermon that Abu Fadl al-Abbas stood on the Kaaba and gave to the people of Mecca. And in that idea, inshallah, we'll begin to have a better understanding of why Karbala took place. So to start off, please raise your voice and a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد.
The Prophet ﷺ, when appointed Prophet at the age of 40, we found that the most close of people around him started to hate him. The first on that list would be Abu Sufyan, or Abu Sufyan. Now if we look at it, Abu Sufyan was his relative. Now in the idea that after Hijrah took place, the reason why Hijrah took place is because he did not have a protector anymore. Whereas Abu Talib was his protector because he lived in his household. Every time his uncles and the people close towards his uncles tried to attack the Prophet, you find Abu Talib there to help him out and aid him. So he was the backbone to the Prophet in the first 10 or 11 years. prior to Hijrah. And after Hijrah took place, that's where we begin to analyze why these people slowly and gradually taught their descendants to hate the progeny of Ahlul Bayt. Now, in the idea that Abu Sufyan, after the Prophet went on Hijrah, Abu Sufyan in the second year after Hijrah took an army with him to fight the Prophet of Islam in Medina. Now, the events that took place in Badr are significant, and remember these names when I mention them. In the Battle of Badr, before the battle took place, they would have 3 people come forth and 3 people from the opposing armies. Now look at the names that came forth. We had first from the opposing army, the army of Abu Sufyan that opposed the Prophet. The 3 that came forth were Abu Sufyan's father-in-law, Utbah. We had his son, Al-Walid, and his brother Shaybah. Remember this. Look how close they are to Abu Sufyan. 3 people from Medina stood up and said, we want to fight. And they said, we don't know your names. We don't know. Our fight is not with the people of Medina. Our fight is with the Prophet from Mecca. So bring forth names that we know. So who came forth? Ali ibn Abi Talib, Hamza, and Ubaidah. Now when this took place, the battle, obviously the 3 we were victorious. Now when the battle took place, 70 people died in the battle of Badr. 70 people died of Abu Sufyan's army. From him, the closest to him. Now Ali ibn Abi Talib killed 35 out of their 70 by himself at the mere age of 20. 35, half of the people that died on the sword of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Now remember that in Badr. And we'll analyze what Yazid said in that courtroom to Sayyidah Zainab. Badr, after that took place, we find many battles after that. Each one, we find he gained more and more hatred as Imam Ali alayhi salam killed from these armies that opposed the Prophet. So much that when Surah At-Tawbah came to the Prophet, they analyzed Ali ibn Abi Talib with Musa. Because his answer says, why do you think that you are greater than Musa? Imam Ali never tries to answer such questions because it creates differences, but he is asked again and again and again. And when he is asked, he says, I am greater than Musa. Why? He says, because when Allah told Musa to return to his land, he was fearful because he killed 1 person. He killed 1 person, he was fearful of what these people will do to him. Whereas Ali ibn Abi Talib, when the Prophet, he says, when the Prophet gave me Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9 of the Quran, to reveal to the Meccans, he said, I did not hesitate for a mere second. Knowing very well in a hadith, it says in Mecca, he says, there was not a household in Mecca except that Ali ibn Abi Talib has killed someone from in battle. Imagine. And that's in relevance to Musa. Now when we take that into perspective, we begin to have a greater idea of what kind of enemies Ahlul Bayt began to develop as years started by. Now remember Badr. Now we move on to Ghadir. In Ghadir, this is the Prophet's first and last Hajj. The first and last Hajj of the Prophet. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. He gathers. In narrations, the small narrations say 100,000 people. The larger one says 140,000 gathered in Ghadir Khum. Now what would happen in Ghadir Khum is the Prophet had a 3-hour lecture. 3 hours in the heat of Ghadir. He would say a line and then he would have people reiterating that line, so people around that vast majority would hear. And he would say, whoever hears me, let them go forth and tell other people that are not here in Ghadir. He had people reiterating and reiterating. Now what happened in Ghadir Khum? Many people differ within the sects, let's say, of Islam. But nonetheless, in the 3-hour lecture, he created a prefix before he said the famous lines. He says, do I not, as the Prophet, have a greater authority on the believers than themselves? أَلَسْتُ أَوْلَى بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ مِنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do I not have a greater authority? Which the reply was, Bala. He says, yes, O Prophet of Allah, you have a greater authority on the mu'mineen than themselves. He says, then, there's the prefix, he says, then, مَنْ كُنْتُ مَوْلَاهُ فَعَلِيٌّ مَوْلَاهُ. He says, then whoever I am his master, now Ali is his master. Now the narrations, what did they come forth and say? The translation says, okay, Ali ibn Abi Talib, he meant as a friend. As a friend. As in all this ahadith and everything that Ali ibn Abi Talib and the Prophet went through, at the first and last Hajj, in front of 140,000 people, the importance is that Ali is my friend. That's in some narrations. I said, let's take that narration from the other schools of thought. At least befriend Ali. Befriend Ali. Let's see what kind of friendship they showed him after the Prophet died. After the Prophet died, whilst Ali ibn Abi Talib is taking care of the burial rituals, they came forth and performed saqifa and chose someone amongst them. While Ali ibn Abi Talib was in the burial rituals of the Prophet of Islam, what kind of friendship did they show Ali ibn Abi Talib? 80 years in narrations on the pulpit of Damascus in Syria, Muawiyah comes forth and curses Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he is looked upon greatly in history. 80 years. And let's leave that for another day. But we find that these kind of people, they were in Khom, in Ghadir Khom. After this happened, you find that many people tried to come amongst themselves and try to plot against Ali ibn Abi Talib. That's why he did not gain Khilafah. And first and foremost, this is the importance of Ghadir Khom. Moving on from Ghadir Khom, we want to look at what? The life of Ali ibn Abi Talib in his Khilafat. In his Khilafat. In the 4.5 years that he was in Khilafat, he had 3 civil wars. 3 civil wars in 4.5 years took the toll out of Ali ibn Abi Talib and his troops. And Muawiyah was one of the people that he led a war against. Siffin, in narrations, 13 months of the year. 13 months it took. So over a year. In battle with Ali ibn Abi Talib. Radiyallahu anhu, radiyallahu anhu. So it's not a problem. Narration says 60,000, narration says 120,000, all going to heaven apparently. Because they all died in the way of Islam. These people in Damascus lived amongst Muawiyah in the idea that what? That Ahlul Bayt were bad. I'll give you an example. When Ali ibn Abi Talib died, in Damascus, it says, who killed Ali ibn Abi Talib? What happened to Ali ibn Abi Talib? It says, Ali died whilst being struck in the mosque in prayer. Now look at the people of Damascus. They ask this question. It says, did Ali ibn Abi Talib pray? Did Ali ibn Abi Talib pray? That's Damascus. When someone comes to Imam Hassan alayhi salam, after the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib, he comes, he says, curse you and curse your father. And in narrations it says that there was not a foul word except that he used in the face of Hassan ibn Ali. Now look at the reply of Ahlul Bayt. Look at the reply, because Imam Hassan knows what kind of people they are, what they have been taught amongst the Damascus environment. So Imam looks at him and says, you must be a stranger to these lands. The man surprises him. What kind of retaliation is this? He says, you must be a stranger to these lands. He says, maybe the air of these environments is harming you. Maybe you do not have a place to stay, come in my house. He says, maybe you do not have food, let me nourish you. Do you have water? Let me quench your thirst. That person looks at him and says, I have just cursed your father, and you treat me in this manner. And later on he comes towards the religion of Ahlul Bayt, the school of Ahlul Bayt, because of what? Because of an action that Imam Hassan showed him, and kindness when he was in anger and in a state of retaliation. Just giving you the idea of what? Giving you the idea of what kind of khilafat and government Muawiyah installed in those years. So you can understand the environment from the Prophet's time, degrading, up until what? Up until Muawiyah and Imam Hassan had the treaty. When the treaty took place, Imam Hassan alayhi salam told him, he wants to do what? People say Imam Hassan was too scared to fight Muawiyah. That's not the case. That was never the case. He went to war against Muawiyah, yet what? Yet we found that his own troops stabbed him in the back. His own troops were brought out by Muawiyah. They saw this world, they did not see the hereafter. And it was easy for Muawiyah to recruit from his armies until he was wounded by his own general. Seeing this and seeing no people that were close to him, Muawiyah found the opportunity to have Imam Hassan alayhi salam sign the treaty. But Imam Hassan alayhi salam, to show us who Muawiyah is, tried to show us through the treaty that Muawiyah is not to be trusted. What do I mean? He puts us guidelines. He said to Muawiyah, I will give you the Khilafah on conditions. What were they? What were the conditions? Of it is a list. Inshallah, I'll go through it tomorrow. But at the end of the list was what? When you die, O Muawiyah, you will give the Khilafat back to me, and if I am dead, you give it to my brother Hussein. You give it back to my brother Hussein. Now, did Muawiyah uphold his word? Of course not. He poisoned Imam Hassan, and after his death, now look at the cunningness of Muawiyah. His second in charge was whom? Was Amr ibn al-As. The cunningness sees no ends. On his deathbed, he writes a will, Muawiyah. He says, no one is to bury me except Amr ibn al-As. No one is to bury me except Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As is thinking to himself, well, I'm next in charge. Delightfully, I'll bury him, not a problem. So as he's burying him, he's about to finish, he's still in the hole, the grave. He sees a sword in his neck, Amr ibn al-As. He looks up at the general. He says, what are you doing? I am now your Khalifa. He says, what are you talking about? I have the will of Muawiyah here. I have the will here. He says, what does the will say? He says, let Amr ibn al-As give his bay'ah to Yazid. Either he does, or bury him with me in the same grave. Bury him with me in the same grave. So he's thinking, either I die or I give my bay'ah to Yazid. He gives his bay'ah to Yazid. Even his friends supposedly did not even show them the slightest of friendship or loyalty. Giving you an example of what this person was. Now, taking all that aside, Amr ibn al-As himself, al-fadlu ma shahida bihi al-a'da', he says the merit is that which your enemy sees in you. Amr ibn al-As himself says about Ali ibn Abi Talib and Ahlul Bayt, many upon. The one of the most well known is when after Muawiyah dies, he goes forth and he's thinking to himself, I don't have anything anymore. And he says, أغويتنا من جهلنا يا ابن هند. He says, you have diverted us from our ignorance, O son of Hind. من النبأ الأعظم الأفضل. He says, from the person that is greater and more rewarding. He says, حيث رفعناك فوق الرؤوس We put you on top of our heads. نزلنا إلى أسفل الأسفل. Because we have gone down. And he says what? He says أين الحصى من نجوم السماء. He says where is the hasa from the stars of the sky? And he says where is Muawiyah from Ali? صلى على And that is his own people. And I've run out of time. Inshallah, we will finish off this topic tomorrow. But I leave you with Sayyida Zainab in the courtroom of Yazid, in which Yazid looks at her and he says, remember the prefix of Badr. Remember this. Because it was his grandfather which was in Badr. Yazid's grandfather was in Badr. He started that. And his relatives died. He says, لَيْتَ أَشْيَاخِي بِبَدْرٍ شَهِدُوا. He says, I wish my grandparents or my grandfathers from Badr were here to see this day. That is the stance of Yazid. In which he goes on to say what? He says, ليت أشياخي ببدر شهدوا جزع الخزرج من وقع الأسل لهلوا واستهلوا فرحا وقالوا يا يزيد لا تشل قد قتلنا القرم من ساداتهم فعدلناهم ببدر فاعتدل. That's the idea of Yazid at the time. This Karbala was in retrospect to what happened to his grandfathers, the kuffar in Badr. And that's when Sayyida Zainab comes forth and says, do as you wish, try your utmost. He says, try your utmost, for by Allah, wallah, lan tamhu dhikrana. He says, by God, you will not finish our remembrance, or will not stop our remembrance. And we see this today, 1,400 years after the death of Imam Hussein on the plains of Karbala. We understand that what he stood for was much greater than we can comprehend. The stance that he took is that of goodness and of Allah's reflection on earth against that which is evil and unjust on earth. That is the stance. And inshallah we will continue this talk tomorrow. We have not concluded this subject, but thank you all, brothers and sisters, respected scholars and elders, for listening. Inshallah we have gained from tonight, and I'd like to finish up by reciting Al-Fatiha, but before it, the loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.